Voice, a discussion on voting rights. Thank you for joining us today for a live stream roundtable discussion on how to protect Black voters. Today's discussion will be both informative and resourceful. So let's get started. It's my pleasure to introduce the Mayor of Houston, Texas, and the President of the African American Mayors Association, Mayor Sylvester Turner. Thank you, Mayor, for joining us today.
Thank you, Phyllis, and good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for joining us today for a critical conversation on voting rights in Black America. As Mayor of Houston, Texas, and President of the African American Mayors Association, I am well aware of the issues our communities face in combating voting restrictions. As seen in recent news right here in Texas, state leaders have threatened access to the ballot box for many minority communities. I, along with my fellow mayors, will remain at the forefront of fighting these issues and protecting our citizens' right to vote. The right to vote is sacred. In the 1800s and 1900s in this country, women and people of color had to fight to obtain that right to vote. In 2021, we find ourselves again fighting bills filed in legislatures across the country that would restrict and suppress the right of people to vote. These bills are Jim Crow 2.0. Given the current national conversation and active legislation threatening voting rights in Black communities across the country, AAMA recognizes the importance of combating voter suppression. Our mayors have pledged to do their part to protect the democratic process, and that's why we've come together today. And thank you for joining us for this important conversation. I also want to acknowledge Mayor of Denver, Michael Hancock, and Mayor of Chicago, Laura Lightfoot, for convening in October a national conversation, bipartisan conversation on voting. I look forward to joining them there. Before we begin, we're going to hear from someone who knows the struggle of fighting for voting rights as well, Congresswoman Eleanor HolmesNorton. Congresswoman Eleanor HolmesNorton, now in her 15th term as a Congresswoman for the District of Columbia, and is the chair of the House Subcommittee on Highways and Transit. Please welcome Congresswoman Eleanor HolmesNorton of the District of Columbia.
I am pleased for the opportunity to speak with the African American Mayors Association today regarding voting rights for African Americans. This past year, we have seen an attack on our voting rights like we haven't seen in decades. And I call on my colleagues in Congress to immediately address these pressing concerns to protect our democracy. Between January 1st and July, at least 18 states have enacted 30 laws that restrict access to the vote. More than 400 bills with voting restrictions have been introduced in 49 states. From harsh voter ID requirements to purging voter rolls. This has to end. I urge my colleagues in Congress to address this by enacting the For the People Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. We cannot wait any longer to enact these important laws to protect that most sacred right, the right to vote. There is one other glaring democracy issue in our country that must be addressed, which is near and dear to my heart: statehood for the residents of the District of Columbia. This bill has now passed in the House at least twice and has had a record number of co-sponsors in the Senate, 45. We are closer than ever to achieving DC statehood and equality for our residents here in the nation's capital. DC pays more federal taxes per capita than any state and pays more federal taxes than 21 states. DC's population is larger than that of Wyoming and Vermont, and the new state would be one of 7 states with a population under 1 million. DC's budget is larger than those of 12 states, and DC's AAA bond rating is higher than those of 34 states. DC has a higher per capita personal income and gross domestic product than any state. 86% of DC residents voted for statehood in 2016. In fact, DC residents have been fighting for voting rights in Congress and local autonomy for 220 years, since the District of Columbia became the nation's capital. The House has passed the For the People Act, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, and the DC Statehood Bill. The Senate currently does not have 50 Democratic votes for the People Act, so last week they introduced a new bill, the Freedom to Vote Act. Either way, though, none of these can pass the Senate as long as the filibuster remains. I therefore urge my Senate colleagues to change the filibuster rules to allow for voter protection laws to be enacted, and I ask that you do the same. Again, I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you here today and to wish you a successful event. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Congresswoman Norton. We value your continued service to the people of DC and our nation, and your leadership in the struggle for voting rights is surely making an impact. Next, we'll hear from another member of Congress, a former mayor, Representative Marilyn Strickland. Congresswoman Marilyn Strickland represents Washington's 10th Congressional District. Prior to Strickland's election to Congress, she served as mayor of Tacoma, where she helped transform a city and economy crippled by a deep recession into a destination for families, workers, artists, tourists, and entrepreneurs. In addition to attracting over $1 billion in investment for housing and businesses, she was instrumental in investing over $500 million in infrastructure for roads, bridges, transportation, and the port, creating over 40,000 new jobs in the Tacoma region. Please welcome Representative Marilyn Strickland.
Hello, Mayor. Unfortunately, the Congresswoman could not make it today, and so we'll move right along in the program. She had an emergency situation.
Okay. Now it's time for our panel discussion to begin. Moderating today's discussion is political analyst and writer Jamal Simmons. Jamal Simmons has focused on politics and media, innovation, economic competitiveness, and diversity for decades. Currently, he explores those items as a political contributor for CBS News, opinion writer for The Hill, and host of hashtag Thesis, FYI, on Instagram and Facebook. Previously, Jamal advised corporate and foundation leaders for the Raven Group, where he was a co-chair of the Internet Innovation Alliance. He also founded a digital media startup to bring together young creative and entrepreneurs of color. In 1992, Jamal helped Bill Clinton win the presidency and set up events around the world for the White House. He also served as a key assistant to the U.S. Trade Representative and Commerce Secretary Mickey Cantor. He was a congressional chief of staff and served in leadership roles for several other campaigns. He was a deputy communications director for Al Gore 2000 presidential run and spokesman in the W Palm Beach during the recount. In 2004, he was traveling press secretary for 2 presidential primary candidates. And in 2008, Jamal was the lead Obama campaign surrogate on CNN and advised the Democratic National Committee during the general election. Please welcome, and we are so excited to have with us today to be the moderator, Jamal Simmons.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm sorry that they made you read that entire that entire bio. I'm excited to be here. I think I have a long relationship with the folks over at the African American Mayors Association. I've worked with them for a long time, both when I was in the consulting practice and now in the media business. And I just think the work that the mayors do is something that really goes unheralded. I grew up in the city with a Black mayor. I grew up in Detroit. So I know not only having a mayor that cares about the community, what that means, but also as a young person growing up, having the person that leads your city be a person that looks like you, that comes from the community that you come from, how empowering it is to have that presence. Before we have Black presidents, we have Black mayors. So Black presidents and vice presidents, we have Black mayors. So thank you. I want to get this started and just go straight to the panel. You've heard all the setup for voting rights and why it's important. This is not a new topic for folks in the country, and certainly for folks in the African American community. So why don't we just go ahead and bring in the folks who are going to talk about it. Mayor Sharon Weston Broom, where are you at? From Baton Rouge. There she is. Mayor Broom, thank you for being here. Mayor Broom is a former city council member, state rep, state senator, first female speaker pro tem in Louisiana. And I want to thank you for being here. Next is Mayor and Hardy Davis. Where is Hardy Davis? Dr. Davis. There he is. Okay. Mayor Davis, is a point of personal privilege. I didn't go there, but I lived down the street from Georgia Tech. So I like the folks who came out of Georgia Tech when I was at Morehouse. We had a very special relationship. He's also from Forsyth, Georgia. He's a pastor, and he was served in the Georgia House and Georgia Senate before he was mayor. And then let's get Lee Chapman online. Is Lee coming up? There's Lee. Lee, thank you for being here. Lee, I want to, before you were at DMV, Deliver My Vote, Lee, you were also at the Leadership Conference for Civil and Human Rights for a long time. Let America Vote, she's a policy director, a Howard University Law School alum. I live in a house with a bison. I got a baby bison who's going to Howard early preschool right now. So I'm surrounded by these Howard people. I want to thank you for being here. And then where's my friend Stephanie Young? There she is. Okay, Stephanie, good morning. You're out in California, so I know this is you got the earliest shift for all of us out in California being here. Stephanie is over at When We All Vote, which was founded by Michelle Obama in 2018, along with some other folks, and they were focused on getting people voted, registered, and activated to turn out, particularly in the 2020 election. I think as many as 500,000 new registered voters that we saw in that election. They can claim a lot of credit for getting that moving. So, and Stephanie was in the Obama White House and also has been working on these issues for a long time. So this is a great panel. I don't want to spend a lot of time talking. I want to get to the panel and ask you some questions. I'm going to start with Mayor Weston Broom. Madam Mayor, New Orleans, Baton Rouge, and Louisiana have been battered by storms across the state. The whole country is now facing a climate crisis where we're seeing, as someone said to me, we had a storm come from Louisiana that made its way to New York City, right, and did damage. This is not normal. This is not the way from the Gulf all the way to New York City. It's not the way the world's supposed to work. So as in a moment where we've got COVID pandemics happening, we've got climate crisis storms occurring, is this the time for us as a nation to be restricting access for voting for people, or trying to find a way to make it easier for people to vote at a time where they may not be as stable as they are, most of the rest of their lives?
Absolutely, Jamal, and thank you for having me on the panel, and to my colleagues on the panel as well. I think it serves us to be even more intentional about making sure that people have access to vote. A good friend of mine recently wrote an article about this whole terminology about being a resilient community. But, you know, while we're resilient, some of the issues still exist that have been systemic for years. And certainly voter suppression is one of those issues. And so while we navigate a pandemic, while we navigate major weather events, I believe it's incumbent upon us as leaders, as mayors, as local leaders especially, to make sure that we get out the vote, that we don't allow these crises to be obstructions to the process, and they can be. That's why we have to be very intentional about making sure that access takes place. Just this morning, I had a conversation with a friend of mine who works in the political sphere about what is happening with the vote now that we have an election coming up, and it has been pushed back because of the weather. So are people confused? Are they getting their early ballots? Do they know when the new election date is? All of this we have to elevate awareness and education among our citizens, especially when we're in the midst of one crisis after another.
That sounds right. And as you're governing your city, I'm gonna stay with you for a second. As you're governing your city and you're thinking about this voter suppression and access questions, how do you find, is it different in different communities, or does the state just play such a large role in how the rules get set up that you find as a mayor, your ability to wiggle and make your own changes is limited?
Well, I think mayors play a role, and as a former legislator, I think the legislature undoubtedly plays a role, and there has to be collaboration. But I will tell you, for me, fighting against voter suppression really starts with keen awareness. You know, it has to start with awareness of our history here in this state of Louisiana and the barriers that have existed that I see are re-emerging with similarities of our history of voter suppression. For example, just recently, our city council was considering changes to our plan of government. We're talking local here now. And so that has to be voted on by the voters. And I oppose these changes in part because the ballot that proponents were seeking to put the initiative on was an off-cycle election that typically doesn't have a high turnout. So it means that while my colleagues down the street at the state capitol are trying to suppress voting rights with certain legislation, we all have to work together in our own sphere of influence as elected officials to make sure that we all are in alignment with preventing these obstructions from taking place. Thank you.
Mayor Davis, you're in Georgia, which is kind of like this is the test case, right? This is the place where all the anti-voter, the voter suppression people are coming together and try to figure out what to do. It started, we saw the Georgia bill was the one that really lit everybody on fire. Can you just tell us a little bit about the changes that have occurred, the changes that are occurring in the state based on what the state legislature and governor are putting in place?
Yeah, thanks, Jamal. I'm excited to be a part of the conversation. First and foremost, I want to thank our president, President Turner, and our ED, Phyllis Dickerson. Welcome to the team. The conversation in Georgia is certainly not a new one. We've seen our fair share of voter suppression and voter intimidation legislation for years. Having spent 8 years in the legislature, like my colleague, Mayor Broom, that's ground zero for many of the things that we see. I want to remind everybody that all politics are local. And so when we look at what's happening in Georgia, particularly with Senate Bill 202, that some have dubbed as the elections integrity bill, I find it to be much less than a bill of integrity. In this legislation, we see great hyper-criminalization of the entire voting process. Georgia's new law codifies mass disenfranchisement. It certainly creates an opportunity for greater voter intimidation. And it expands the criminalization policy of the voting process, where this, quite frankly, is a right that we all should enjoy with free, equal, and fair access to the ballot box. That's not what's happening in the great state of Georgia. When you look at criminalization of line warming opportunities, where people who historically in the cold would come and provide hand warmers, provide hot chocolate and things like that. We've now got criminalization measures in this legislation that make it a crime to be able to do that. We go beyond that to where you see the state elections or state ethics board now create an opportunity for them to come in and take over local elections boards. That conversation is happening right now in Fulton County, and everyone across the state of Georgia, all 159 counties, should be concerned that at any point in time, their local elections board could be unilaterally thrown out and being taken over by the state elections board. What we've done in Augusta is taken a very direct approach from a policy standpoint with my council. We work very closely with our elections board, as well as our executive director of the local boards of elections, to make sure that we're doing a series of things. I think it starts with, first and foremost, communicating in ways that we historically have not done before, because elections have changed so much. When you think about the elections of 2020, we were supposed to have primaries in May. They didn't happen until June because of COVID and the challenges associated with that. And so you've got to communicate in every medium that's available to us. The radio, elected officials have to communicate. Social media, we have to amplify the message around, one, getting out to vote, but the candidates of choice as well. And so we've got to do a much better job of that than we've done perhaps even in the past. The second thing we've got to do is make sure that our local boards of elections are working in concert with the council at the local level to make sure that we've got the appropriate people there, because what we don't want is what's happening in Fulton County, where we've got the state elections board saying we're going to come in and take over. And then I think the third thing is continuing our grassroots effort. I'm pleased to have been a founding member of When We All Vote Civic Cities Mayors, initial group of 31 mayors. And so we took that as an opportunity to engage voters across all spectrums of life, even in the high schools, and got them out in 2020 into 2021 when we elected Georgia's two newest Democratic senators. Those are things that we have to do, particularly when you've got egregious legislation like Senate Bill 202 that's been put in place.
Thank you. It's a definitional question. We're talking about voter suppression, but how would you define this idea of state legislatures taking over local election boards? It feels a little like voter nullification to me.
Well, I don't disagree with you. I think it certainly is voter nullification. In fact, we in communities of interest all across the state of Georgia, we decide who our elections personnel are. And for the state to unilaterally come in and decide, well, that's not who we want, they're not doing what we want them to do, that's not only nullification, but that's completely disenfranchising communities of interest all across the state of Georgia. When you look at, again, 159 counties, some 537 cities and municipalities, we've got a lot of work to do, and we have to be vigilant about this. I've heard the term Jim Crow 2.0, but I think it's much more than that. When you look at all across this nation, we have been told, and we see this even with the most recent census numbers, that you've got people of color, Black and brown communities, where they are becoming the majority all across this nation. And certainly even in Georgia, we're seeing almost a 51 to 49, where you've got Black and brown communities being more of a majority and in larger numbers, especially in Metro Atlanta. And those are things that are concerning to the majority party at this time. But we've got to be more vigilant, especially as we're building coalitions, wanting to make sure that people have their voices heard. We fought for this for so long. From 1964 to now, the fight continues.
Yes, sir. Lee, you've been at this for a long time. You both in Washington and working with folks out in the States in the field. Tell me how your organization is working on this, and where do you think the national efforts are? We heard Congresswoman HolmesNorton talking about it for a second, but where are the national efforts in terms of getting a voting rights law passed? Do you know what's happening right now on the Hill?
Sure. So thanks so much for the for having me. I really appreciate it. So I am executive director of Deliver My Vote. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that has a really narrow focus, and our mission is to increase voter turnout among young Black and Brown voters through the use of vote by mail. So what we do is we run direct voter contact programs and work with organizers in states who develop relationships with voters all year round. So they have the tools and resources and information so they can register to vote and take control of their ballot and vote from home. So that's our mission and our work. And it's so important because, in 2020, we saw the highest voter turnout that we've ever seen in over a century, really. And that's something to celebrate, that voters went and cast their ballot in the middle of a pandemic. But one piece of the story that a lot of people aren't talking about is the fact that there are over 80 million eligible voters in our country that did not vote in the 2020 election. So there's still a lot of work to be done to make sure that voters are able to have the information that they need so they can have their voice heard out at the ballot box. So one thing that we do is we speak with voters all year round, and it's really important, especially when you look at the Black community, because all too often, Black voters are only contacted by advocacy groups during the period of voter registration and also during the period of get out the vote right before the election. And there isn't this constant communication with voters. So that's our goal, is for our organizers to have those conversations all year round, which is really critical. And, Mayor Davis spoke about Georgia, for instance, right? Georgia has SB 202, which is a restrictive voting bill that has rolled back a lot of the progress that was made during 2020. So now in Georgia, for instance, voters have to have a photo ID to actually request a vote by mail ballot. And that's in effect now for the 2020 municipal election. So we're working with our partners on the ground in Georgia to make sure voters have that information about how they can vote under the current rules, because elections are still happening. So, like you mentioned, there's two main federal bills around voting that are moving through Congress right now: the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which would modernize and restore Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. So states that have a recent history of voter discrimination would have to pre-clear their voting changes, get approval by the Department of Justice before they went into effect. So that's moving. Also, there's a new bill that the Freedom to Vote Act, which would expand access to the ballot. It would have automatic voter registration, same-day voter registration, online voter registration. But it's a challenge to get those passed because Congress is really gridlocked right now, right? And in the Senate, you need to have at least 10 Republican votes to pass legislation. So, as that advocacy is happening, as organizations are suing against restrictive bills like SB 202 in Georgia, elections are happening now. So our goal is to make sure that voters have the information that they need to cast their ballot under the current rules as they exist. Because to me, the best antidote to voter suppression is voter education and voter empowerment, and making sure that voters have that information all year round.
Great. Stephanie, you guys done yeoman's work over the last few years on this question. And as this issue has gotten to be more impactful over the last, 6 months since Election Day, really, right? And there were forces that were looking to make voting an issue going forward. Do you think this is something that voters are going to pay attention to in the 2022 and 24 elections? Is it something that people are thinking about? Is it permeating the kind of the general sensibility, or is this just something the insiders, those of us who follow this every day, we're worried about? Or do you think it'll drive some voter activity?
Well, thanks for having me. It's good to see everyone. To answer your question right off the bat, yes, I do think that it's seeping in. And I think that voter suppression is not only a physical manifestation of blocking people from voting, but it's also psychological. And what it tells people is that it's going to be hard. It's going to be difficult. Your vote won't count. So all of those 80 million, Americans who did not vote in 2020, they're more likely not to, right? Because what are they hearing about voting? They're hearing that it's harder. They're hearing that there's restrictions. They're hearing that they are not wanted at the polls, and we're going to make it as difficult as possible for them to vote. So I think, a big part of our work in the nonprofit space, but folks who are working to not just educate, but also inspire voters to get out there in innovative and creative ways. We have an uphill battle because we're trying to fight all the noise that they're hearing about how hard it is to vote. It was already difficult in 2020, right? So to add a whole nother layer on there, and when you hear there's over 400 bills that have passed in state legislatures all across this country, we're talking about 48 states. The majority of states have taken action against Americans' right to vote. So that is an intimidating factor. And through our research, we know that a lot of Americans are already intimidated by the process. That's why they do not engage. So, and when we all vote, which, as you mentioned, was started by Michelle Obama in 2018, we are on a mission to change the culture around voting and to increase participation in each and every election by helping to close a race and age gap. We try to do this in culturally creative ways. We partner with organizations like Lee's. We started a mayoral program called Civic Cities. We'll be relaunching that very soon. We're going to have an advisory council of mayors that can be a part of that. So I cannot wait to talk more about that at some point. But we know that we have to go at this at all angles. Not only do we have to educate, we have to inspire, and we have to seep into culture. So what does that mean? When you're watching, the MTV Music Awards or the BET Awards, you hear about voting. We cannot let up and talk about it only right before a big general election in a moment, because there is that education factor that has to happen. How do you do it? A lot of people literally do not know. And I've sat in on focus groups and tried not to get discouraged at how all of this misinformation has really, I think, rocked the American people. And I also feel like, unfortunately, the way in which, we're educating this country, we do not get a civics education. So you graduate from high school, you go all the way through college. And if your parents have not taught you about the importance of voting, if you haven't gotten it from church, if you haven't gotten it from anywhere else, you don't get it. So it takes us to come in and try to help you get it and understand these things. And we really are literally fighting an uphill battle, but it is possible because we had over 500,000 people start in it and or complete the voter registration process through When We All Vote. And we're trying to make sure those people don't sit down and sit back, but understand voting is the first step in the process to being civically engaged, which means to holding your elected officials accountable when they don't do things that you like, or when you don't feel like your city is growing or your state is moving in the right direction or attacking COVID in the right ways. We're trying to really build an entire citizen to understand that voting is literally only the first step. And we're trying to do that through our My School Votes program, which is our high school program where we will come in and help an entire school district create a civics education program, mostly after school, so that they can dive in and understand how to organize, get registered, and ready to vote. And we know we have to start early because research shows us that if you vote for the first time at 18, you're more likely to become a lifelong voter, and that's what we're trying to do as well.
So whose job is it to educate Kanye and Lil Wayne?
Unfortunately, I think that they're lost causes. And that's really that's also the problem, and that's why Ms. Obama has a huge co-chairs. She has a huge number of co-chairs, from Tom Hanks all the way to Janelle Monáe, Chris Paul, and others that join her and lift their voices in this space, because you have that other side of people saying things like, my vote, it doesn't matter, or, they're voting for someone based on taxes or these erroneous things. So it's really important that we have a collection of voices like the mayors, all the way up to figures like Michelle Obama that are speaking out on these topics continuously.
Thank you. I'm sorry to put you on the spot about Kanye. Mayor Broom, in 2020, you enacted the Mayor's Commission on Racial Equity and Inclusion. And so you're focused on measurable outcomes and promoting greater accountability. How has this legislative initiative worked to mitigate inequity in Baton Rouge?
Well, the commission that we call CORI for short has worked to certainly mitigate inequity in Baton Rouge by creating a very comprehensive blueprint for how to address many different areas of inequity. We all know that inequity isn't a one-size-fits-all situation. There is inequity in healthcare, access to education, economic prosperity, and they're generational symbols of inequity. So we took this holistic approach to inequity by having several subcommittees research critical needs and critical areas of our community to create deliverables we could see to implement through executive action or by legislative instrument. I think the greatest impact is that this commission has forced some really difficult conversations. And the work of the committee shed light on decades of old issues and wounds from our community. And it really forced leaders to step up, to own them and address them. And of course, conversations around voter suppression were among those conversations.
Yeah, I'm going to ask both of you this question, both of the mayors, because you're elected, and so you're seeing this real time, and you're in states where this is happening, particularly Mayor Davis. The cultural demographic change that is happening in America right now seems like it is driving a reaction from these legislative forces, these political forces that are looking to limit the power of new voters that are coming into the system. Is that what you're seeing? I mean, what's the impact of these demographic changes on places like where you are in Augusta?
Yeah, I think you're seeing that across the entire state of Georgia. Certainly you're seeing it in the country, but the big challenge is that these efforts that begin in the state legislature, they impact us at the local level as well. When you look at the fact that part of this power grab with Senate Bill 202 was to consolidate power under the elections authority, our elections board that the GOP controls, as opposed to the state secretary who is elected by everyone. Yes, he's a Republican, but at the end of the day, consolidation of power to include the ability to take over local boards of elections when they do not operate in unison or concert with what the majority party has brought forth. You look at majority minority communities, DeKalb, Fulton, Clayton, Macon-Bibb, Savannah, Chatham, Augusta, Richmond, where in our communities, we certainly turned out the election for Senators Warnock and Ossoff. And in those communities, they were majority brown and black and brown communities. And so when you see that happening, again, every effort from a legislative standpoint has an emphasis around that as well. I think once again, where we've got to be more adept at from a local legislative standpoint is how we engage our local boards of elections in terms of their role, how we can be supportive from a local government standpoint. Obviously, the state law would take over, but we've got to make sure that we put in place, even when it comes to things like drop box, provisional ballots. We've got to find workarounds to how we begin navigating beyond much of what the state has done, especially in light of Senate Bill 202. So I'm seeing some of the same things that Mayor Broom is seeing in terms of outcomes. But again, the issues around equity and inclusion, ballot access is critical. When you look at communities that don't have their own private vehicle, you've got to make drop boxes available all across the county. You can't have a single drop box available and expect someone who lives on the outskirts of town to get 15 miles into town just to be able to drop something off. Those are the types of challenges that we're seeing in Georgia, notwithstanding the fact that at the local level, again, we were very fortunate that we didn't have this challenge in Augusta. We've been pretty robust, and our elections director does a fantastic job. But in other communities where you've got a limited number of voting machines, that's where you've got to be more deliberate. The issues of long lines, the issues of where you go into a community center and they've only got 10 voting machines, and you've got 12,000 people who are coming through there. That's not going to work. So we've got to be more adept at the local level in terms of how we address those issues.
Mayor Broom, I remember talking to Mayor Landrieu when he was still in New Orleans about bringing the statues down. And, you're talking about your Corey initiative. Stephanie just mentioned disinformation and battling that. One of the things that I remember him talking about is kind of like uninformation, right? Like people don't know the full story about how things worked. He talked in particular about a area in New Orleans where people would get up and give speeches, and most people in the community thought of that place as a political place. It's just a place where politicians get up and give speeches. But for the Black people in New Orleans, they also knew that it used to be a slave market, right? So we haven't told the whole story about our history. And so when you're thinking about what you're doing in terms of, trying to educate people and get them moving, how do you battle this sort of disinformation or people just don't know the real story about what's happening as America's changing and the fear is setting in?
Yeah, Jamal, it takes a very intense effort to do that. I heard both Stephanie and Lee talk about the creativity and the innovation that is needed to motivate even people, our people to vote. But that's one of the assets that our commission has served. It has certainly addressed and through some of the policies and recommendations that have come up, some of the challenges that we face as a community that has a history first and foremost, and the ongoing concerns of a community that's becoming a predominantly African American, brown, Black community here. And so it causes, and I use this word a lot, it causes a lot of us to lean in and be extremely intentional, because equity, addressing these issues of history that are thorns in the flesh for many of us, it just doesn't happen. We have to lean in, and as leaders, elevate certainly the awareness around these issues, but use our positions as catalysts for change as we bring in folks from the community. I do want to say that this conversation around elevating awareness about voting rights and dismantling the obstruction to voting rights, it has to become a part of the fabric of every community. We have to be vigilant. We can't just assume it's going to happen, and we have to be vigilant right now because we see what's unfolding.
Let me mention one more thing.
Yeah,
Jamal.
please.
I think Stephanie and Lee both said it. We've got to be engaged, and now Mayor Broom is saying it. We've got to be engaged in this conversation throughout the course of the year, not just when there's a big general election or when there's a primary, whether it's gubernatorial or presidential. We have to talk about this all the time, especially in light of this disinformation, voter disinformation, this election misinformation. Here it is, September of 2021, and we're still being told that what happened in November of 2020 didn't happen. And so people are confused. 80 million voters who did not go to the polls and vote, and they're hearing this garbage. And so the more they hear that, the more they begin to question not only the process of voting, but the notion of election integrity that's being called into question because of the disinformation. And so we've got to do a much better job of communicating, amplifying, educating, and empowering throughout the entire course of the year, because someone's going to hear something and it's going to cause them to question whether they should even ever go and pick up a ballot.
Yes, that's right. And Lee, again, you've been doing this for a long time. I think back to my old history classes. People who think of America as being a white nation, that now people of color are starting to invade, or they say don't replace us. They don't know American history, right? I mean, the reality is the West was always majority Latino. White people moved out there, majority Native American, and whites moved out there. And in the South, you had places like Mississippi and South Carolina that were majority African American for much of the 19th century. And then Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, which were like 40% or more African American, right? So, it's always been, there have always been a lot of people. But what we've seen, this is not the first time that people have used the legal process to stop it. I mean, in places like South Carolina and others, where they instituted slave codes in the early 1800s. Like, so, and the Supreme Court has, in a lot of ways gone along with the rules used to suppress particularly Black participation in American society. So as you're thinking about this and the work that you're doing, and I'm asking you this because you're also the lawyer. I'm going to make you the lawyer, our lawyer on this case. where are the places that we go for refuge? Like, how is it that we push back on this resurgence of legal efforts to restrict the participation of people of color in American society?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, throughout our history, you've seen, whenever we've made progress, there's always been a backlash, right? And that's what we're seeing right now with the progress of so many people participating and voting. We're seeing the backlash of states, passing these laws really to surgically make it harder for people of color to vote, to really justify the big lie and to justify this non-existent voter fraud that people are saying has happened, which is not the case at all. So, it's really challenging because the courts, are really not in our favor right now. There was a voting rights decision earlier this year that, just is making it harder for people to vote. So it's really about speaking with voters directly one-on-one, so they have the information that they need to vote. And so that's, I think, where we all need to focus right now. And we need to focus early. Because at Deliver My Vote, one thing that we found in 2020, we worked in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Florida. And we found when we had those conversations with voters about, what's your plan? How are you going to vote? It significantly increased voter turnout. So in Pennsylvania, for example, when we had conversations with voters, we saw a 17% increase in turnout. And when we had multiple conversations following up with them about their plan to vote, we saw a 23% increase in turnout. And that's just one state. So making sure that we have those conversations with voters is going to be the key while, the courts, those cases in the courts are playing out, while the federal laws are playing out, because there's such a huge knowledge gap. Our canvassers, when they speak with voters are confused about what to do if their ballot didn't make it. Can they still vote, right? Or where their nearest ballot drop box is, or where their polling place is, even what's on the ballot and what the races are. One thing I found that's really interesting is the census actually puts out a survey after every presidential election asking voters about what their experiences are, why they didn't vote, if they didn't participate. And they also break it down by race. So when you look at Black voters in particular, the number one reason Black voters say they don't vote is because they're not interested in the election, voter apathy. The second reason is having an illness or a disability. And the third reason is being too busy or just having a schedule that's conflicting with the election. So I think voters want to vote, but because of illness or disability or work obligations or family obligations, they really just need help having to navigate the system. So that direct voter contact, that education and empowerment is going to be critical as we're fighting in the courts and fighting in Congress and in these states.
Thank you. I do want to say, for those people who are watching, we are going to get to questions from the audience. So please put any questions you have in the comments and we'll circle back to those. Stephanie, so you're working at this, you and Lee both are working at this from the nonprofit side, not from the elected side, right? So, and you're coming at this nonpartisan nonprofit. How are organizations on your side of the wall and the fence, how are you working together? I mean, I know you're building internal capacity. How are you working together with some of the other organizations that are out there doing this work? So we're not seeing maybe duplicative efforts, but people who are really finding new places to go and new voters to find. How's that working on your side, the coordination?
Yeah, I mean, look, at When We All Vote, we have such a big megaphone because we have the voice of Michelle Obama and others. So we know that a part of our job is to lift up the work that folks are doing on the ground. So for instance, today we're having a huge rally. It's called Back to the Ballot Box. We're trying to get our volunteers engaged. We recruited over 25,000 people who signed up to be voting squad captains in 2020, and we're trying to expand that right now. And this is our first kind of go at it as we look ahead to next week, which will be National Voter Registration Day. We're going to have an entire week of action where we're asking people to go out in their communities and get folks registered to vote. But tonight, they're going to learn how to do that if they don't know how, and get a refresher course in here from Mrs. Obama and Chris Paul and others. So, but, we're taking the time to add in, Move On Texas, or is it Move Texas? I'm sorry, it's not Move On, it's Move Texas. That's doing some really great voter registration and engagement work there. We work really closely with organizations like Fair Fight. We just had Ms. Obama and Stacey Abrams team up and do a message about voter suppression and making your voices heard. To the earlier question that you had, we've already had 14,000 people take action by calling their senators or congressmen and women and asking them to support federal voting rights legislation. So, we're trying to lift up the folks that are doing the work on the ground. We're also trying to lift up those who are helping to advocate for voting rights and provide that platform for them, because sometimes these organizations just don't have the reach, and we've been able to build a good amount of reach. So we look at ourselves as like, please come and let us know what you're doing so that we can help lift up the work that you're doing and figure out how to partner with you on the ground right where you are. Another thing that we do, and we did in 2020, and we did this also with Mayor Davis, we did events all around the country called Fuel the Vote, which were drive through, food bank services along with voter registration and engagement. We did it in Atlanta, we did it in Augusta, we did it in Pittsburgh, we did it all around this country, and we knew that that was really effective. But we also partnered with local organizations on the ground. So we either worked with the mayor's office or other local organizations. We granted organizations as well to do this work. And another thing that we do is called Vote Together. It's a program. We really call it Party at the Polls, because we know that people are more likely to vote when there is some sort of celebratory event at a polling place, from a DJ to some food, which, folks are trying to restrict us from doing that right now, but we know that works. So what we say is, we work with the state tables, or we work with whoever, makes the most sense in that state, and say, hey, we'll give you X amount to put on a party at the poll. And we give them a toolkit on how to do it and how to, get that into our Mobilize platform, which is on our website, where anyone can go and sign up to find an event where they are. So we value working with organizations to do this work. And we really do kind of know and understand what our lane is, and that's to lift others, but it's also to big splashes and big moments and get attention when we need it. And you mentioned earlier about the refuge, and Lee responded to that. I just want to add just a little
Please.
to that. One thing we know is that because of all the voter suppression and disinformation, all the tactics that are happening now, like, we've worked overtime to educate people on federal legislation. What does it mean? What does it look like? But also to empower them to use their voice. As I mentioned, 14,000 people have taken action. You can go right to our website, click and sign in, and become, one of those people that you're able to send a tweet, an email, call, all of those things to your senator or House members, and we give them scripts. We want to be, a refuge when people feel like, well, there's nothing I can do about it. And I think to my earlier point around voter suppression being psychological, it is to make you feel defeated. So we want people to feel empowered, because just as millions of people hit the streets right after the murder of George Floyd all around this world, what happened? We saw legislation addressing it. Now, will we ever pass that? I'm not sure. It's going to take another movement, but we need folks to understand that voter suppression has to be as big. We can't just talk about it, and we can't just tap in when we feel like it, but we have to really create a movement of Americans really ready to fight for their voting rights. And we haven't been able to do that, I don't think, since the 60s in a real robust way. So it's how are we creating that type of energy on the ground and empowering people that they actually have the power to move the needle forward on this?
Yeah, you remind me of, I think it was 2008 when Bethune-Cookman College, when they moved the voting places at Bethune-Cookman in Florida, and the students at Bethune-Cookman, instead of not voting, organized a march to the new polling place. And they walked literally like a couple of miles away from college campus en masse to go vote and overwhelm that polling place. But sort of this defiant statement of, you're going to try to suppress us, but we're not going to take it. Like, we're going to do it anyway. So I like that kind of thinking. And Mayor Davis, I'm coming to you here because your name was invoked here a couple of times. And so I want to talk to you a little bit, or have you talk to us about the Civic Cities Initiative and why you chose to get involved with that with When We All Vote. I think we lost your audio.
Yeah, anytime you can be associated with First Lady Michelle Obama, I think it's an opportunity that you don't sit back and wait on. And so it was important for us to not only engage from a civic city standpoint, but as Stephanie said, it provided an opportunity at a grassroots level to help us elevate the conversation on why voting was so important. And in light of the elections of 2020, what was at stake for us? I mean, we saw what took place in Georgia in 2018, and it's important for us to be able to engage voters across all spectrums. And so we lend our voice to that, but also, quite frankly, the platform of the mayor's office. When you are in a city of 203,000+ people, they trust the voice of the mayor. And one of the things that was available to us, again, through When We All Vote Civic Cities, is not just the resources, but more importantly, being able to stay on message of how important it was to vote, where those polling places and locations were, being able to coordinate our messaging and engage citizens in a way that we had not done before. I think about the food drive, fueling the vote, how important that was in our city at a critical time where there was a question on the other side of the primaries, the primaries of 2020, were we going to be able to get people back out in light of, we were in the height of the pandemic. The state was not sending out 6 million absentee ballot requests at that time. They had stopped that. And so being able to get out and mobilize folks, it was cold during that period of time as well. And so Civic Cities allowed us a resource and they were able to help stretch things for us, not just in Augusta proper, but across the entire county, as well as in neighboring counties where folks knew, hey, this is what's going on in Augusta. When We All Vote Civic Cities and the mayor's office, they're working together. They're bringing groups of people together, other voting organizations, Black PAC, they showed up in the city as well. So it was a collaborative effort, again, around this big umbrella of where the First Lady's voice and really her reach across this nation as a trusted voice made it so important for us. And that's why we did that. I want to mention something that I think is extremely important, and this kind of dovetails with Lee's mention around the 80 million voters. As we think about educating and empowering going forward, this is a critical path item for cities, mayors, and communities all across America. And that is, if you have not voted in successive elections, in our elections boards, they take you off of the rolls. So part of our efforts going forward have got to be, we want to register new voters. That's important to us. But we've got to make sure that that 80 million group of voters who have not voted in successive elections in a long period of time, we go back and engage them in a way and say, you have to get out and vote. Otherwise, we're going to be starting the process over with them where we're having to re-register them, which again, makes our efforts even more difficult. So I just want to mention that because it's such a critical path item for us when you start thinking about Senate Bill 202 in Georgia and how we've already seen them purging voter rolls and how quickly that happens. I think even in this most recent cycle, there were some 200,000+ people who were purged from the voter rolls. Those are large numbers of people that happen at one point in time. So we've got to be more vigilant about that. And again, I think this is an opportunity for us.
You know, Mayor Broom, the mayor just reminded me of something else. Very often when people go to vote, you know, for a long time we did voter registration drives. I used to call it the sheet, you know, Rosa Parks sat down so you could stand up, you know, way of approaching thing. And I think a lot of young people would see those messages and they wouldn't be particularly motivated by it. Like, it's your responsibility to do it. You have to do it. You know, it's like, yeah, okay. People vote because they think they're going to get something out of the activity, right? There's going to be some result that's going to benefit their lives, not just because their parents or grandparents expect them to. Unless you're in my family where my great aunt says nobody could come to Thanksgiving if they didn't have a voted state. Unless you're one of those extreme cases. But you've run for office at the state level, at the local level. What do you think motivates the voters in your community, and how is it that we should be talking to people about what are the important issues that they care about while we're talking about registering them, what's really going to motivate them to get up and do this?
Well, before I share with that, I have to tell you, Jamal, when you made that statement about your aunt, I'm a baby boomer. It reminded me of my dad. If I brought anybody over to my house, the first thing he was going to ask you was what political party you belong to. If you said the wrong party, you were not welcomed in the Weston household. Let me just say that. But India Ari has this song, and it says, when young people talk to old people, and Democrats talk to Republicans, it makes us all better people. That's the name of the song. And I always use that as an example because for me as a leader, I surround myself with an intergenerational team. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the approach that we have to use. And I will tell you that when I talk to the young generation, if you will, whether it's Gen X or whatever, they are interested in how do they thrive and prosper in a community that they live in. So they're interested in economics. They're interested in, education. They're interested in civil rights, they're interested in police reform and these very prevalent issues that hit them head on. And so it's important that that becomes a part of the conversation when we talk about, moving forward with the vote, that the way you change these issues is to certainly have people who represent your interests in positions. I believe that's one way to motivate and to keep the intergenerational connection always at the table.
Yeah. Sometimes I can remember when I used to do politics in Georgia, I worked for Senator Cleland, Max Cleland. And I can remember someone was putting together like a youth voting initiative. And it had somebody, I'm not going to call the name because that would be embarrassing, but it had like a 75-year-old actor that they were inviting to come and do this youth engagement program. And I just thought this program was not put together by anybody who talks to someone under the age of 30. Like this was like what older people think young people should do, which in my experience is very often not persuasive to young people. So Leah, I want to ask you a question about Deliver My Vote. You guys executed the 2020 Plan to Save Votes program. Relied on a widespread team of trained canvassers. I talked about that a little bit. What did you learn from that? And were any large gaps in voter knowledge identified that could be filled through some targeted programming?
Yeah, sure. So through our program, as I mentioned before, our canvassers spoke with voters about, how to register to vote, how to request their ballot, how to return it, how to fix any issues if those occurred with their ballots. So we were in constant communication with voters about how to make a plan to vote. And what we found was that helped increase voter turnout. One really interesting fact that our partners in Pennsylvania found is that just the act of requesting a vote by mail ballot increases turnout. So a voter might ultimately end up voting early in person or actually at the polling place on election day. But the fact that they took the initiative to request a vote by mail ballot increases turnout. When you look at young voters, voters of color, Black and brown voters, in places like Philadelphia, it increases turnout by over 10 times. So, the pandemic was new. We saw a lot of new voters use vote by mail for the first time. A lot of my friends and family used it for the first time, to make sure that they were safe during the election. But when people start using something, they're going to continue to use it again. So we're doing a lot of deep research into voter sentiment, how voters feel, especially voters of color, feel about using it moving forward in light of a lot of the voter suppression tactics that we're seeing around the country. But I think it's really exciting that vote by mail can be used as an organizing tool, right? We just want people to vote. We want everyone to have all the options available, right? If it's early in person or on election day, but if we can use this as a tool to engage voters, we're really excited about that and happy to share more as that research, is unveiled.
That's great. Thank you. I know we are about to lose one of our panelists, but I didn't want him to take off without saying thank you to Mayor Hardy Davis for being on the call, being a part of the conversation, and also the work you've been doing to push back in Georgia and also to be supportive of these voting rights initiatives around the country. So I want to thank you for being here. We lost your audio again.
Thank you, Jamal, and to my colleagues. I appreciate the work that you all are doing. I look forward to continuing this work. It's so important, and it couldn't come at a more important time in our nation's history across cities, states, and municipalities. Mayor Broom, we'll talk soon. Stephanie, I'm on the team, and Lee, I look forward to connecting with you.
Okay.
All right, thank you.
Take care. Lee, thank you for your comments. And I'm going to go to, we do have a question from the audience, so let's get those in. So if anyone else has any other questions, please post them in the comment section and we'll get to them. This question is about rural leadership. How do we galvanize rural mayoral leadership to work with county officials to spur voter registration efforts? I'm going to turn that over to you, Mayor Broom.
Well, here, for example, in Louisiana, and I'm sure this is just a snapshot of what happens in other communities, there are organizations, for example, among Black elected officials, and I have been to a number of organizational meetings where the rural communities certainly lean in with some of the larger cities for assistance. So I think whether they come to us, it's incumbent upon us as members of larger communities to make sure that we reach out and touch them as well and help them and help empower them so that they are able to connect with the resources and tools to help motivate and increase voter turnout.
Great. And Stephanie, there's a question in here about engaging election officials and the community to help expand access to voting. I'm wondering, as you all are doing your work, and Lee, you can get in on this too, how much engaging elected officials is helpful to you? Do you find that people are responsive, and how are you all using them in addition to what you're doing with the mayors?
Yeah, I'll jump in. It just depends, and especially as a non-profit, nonpartisan organization.
Yeah.
It just sometimes it's not helpful, but sometimes it really is. And I think it actually depends on the relationship that the elected official has within their community, right?
Mm-hmm.
We had a great call the other day with the chairwoman of the Congressional Black Caucus, with a lot of our volunteers and supporters, and that went over really well, and there's a lot of interest. But I also know that we had a lot of links on the line and a lot of other folks that were affiliated with organizations that she was a part of as well. So, I absolutely think it depends. However, it is important for elected officials to be having these conversations publicly because of the stigma around voting rights and voting work being partisan. It's not. So if more elected officials did talk about it on a regular basis, especially, Republican elected officials, independents, and Democrats, that would, I think, help to potentially end the stigma that it is partisan. But it seems like, granting people access to vote in this country has become partisan, which makes no sense. But it's not a partisan issue. It's an American issue, right? So, engaging the elected officials is important, but I also think if you are a citizen and you want to see your mayor, or if you want to see your governor, if you want to see your elected officials, take more of a voice in this space, you have every right, and you absolutely should reach out to them and tell them you want to hear them say that they support voting rights, and what they're willing to do to make voting in your city or your state easier. And then also for your federal representatives, letting them know that you want them to support federal legislation. So it's a two-way street. And I think that's one of the issues that people don't understand about democracy. It's not just, one side. We have to be involved in the game, and being involved in it is making sure that we are having these conversations, and it goes both ways.
And Lee, you can weigh in on that, but also we have a
Yeah.
question here. What are 3 great conversation starters? 'Cause I think this maybe goes together. You're engaging election officials, other people, surrogates who you're bringing out for the events that you're doing and engagement. But the conversation starters that get people willing to open up and discuss voting and registration and be a little bit more open to participating.
Yeah. So with election officials, I would say, it's really important to engage them. And an organization that we work closely with, the National Vote at Home Institute, works very closely with election officials on best practices and policies around implementing vote by mail. But, elected officials are also trusted messengers. And there's a lot that election officials can do to encourage, civic education, voting, registering to vote, signing up to vote by mail. They can help recruit poll workers, which we saw was, there was a huge effort to recruit poll workers in 2020 because of the pandemic. And, unfortunately, we're in this situation for a while. So there's going to be a need moving forward. And election officials can also really help direct important resources, city resources to elections. It could be polling place sites or other resources within their domain. So I think that's a very important group to engage at all levels. And local, municipal elected officials are really critical for that. On the conversation starter question, I think it's always good, at least when I'm having conversations with people, just to tell your story about why you vote, what moves you to vote, how you voted for the first time. I know my parents would take me voting, and I actually, as a kid, I don't think they do this anymore, but when I would go to the polling place with them, I would actually have like a kid ballot where I could vote, right? So they really engaged me at a very young age and made sure that I was engaged, and I was registering voters at a local mall at the age of 12 with some organizations I was part of. So I think having those conversations about why we're voting, why it's important, how it connects to our day-to-day lives, which Mayor Broom talked about earlier, is the way to open the conversation.
Can I add to that too, Jamal? Oh, you're muted. I just want to add to that as well. Just there's a lot of voter shame. So meaning if you haven't participated and you're intimidated by the process, not being afraid to just start the conversation with anyone, right? So if you are a person starting a conversation with a full adult that has never participated in the process, you do have to, I think, approach it with no judgment. And I think as voters, we are judgy. I know I judge. It's hard not to. You're like, what? But we can't. That's not the best way to get someone involved that has been shy or nervous about it. And it's really, as Lee mentioned, when she was a kid, she was able to fill out a ballot. She was able to experience it. So it's not only is it like saying, hey, have you ever gotten registered to vote? Have you voted before? If they say no, I will do it with you. I'll go with you throughout the entire process. I'll show you where to go. I'll show you how to do it. Don't worry. I know it can be intimidating. One thing, folks really don't understand everything on the ballot, right? We had a conversation before. Mrs. Obama said, there's times where I didn't know everything on the ballot. It's okay. So having those kind of vulnerable conversations about it's not a test about what you know, but it's rather, making sure that you're prepared and working with that person on getting prepared and letting them know that you'll be that partner with them.
Yeah, when Lee was talking about doing that as a kid, I remember my dad having me, who also was involved in politics, having me, walk door to door, block after block after block, putting, leaflets in people's doors at 12, 13, 14 years old. My brother still talks about the bad hot dogs we had to eat, at the Democratic Party headquarters. Mayor, I guess I just want to circle back as we're going to kind of round the bend into some final thoughts and questions. And we talked about the conversation starters. But I'm wondering, since now I have my all-female panel, I'm going to lean into this for a minute. I'm wondering if there's a difference, right, in how you talk to particularly younger male voters about some of these questions versus maybe some of the women voters. And are there things that you found that we know that women tend to overperform in elections versus particularly young Black men. What do you think is behind that? What are they voting on that's really motivating them? And how do you kind of gauge how you engage those voters differently, if at all?
I believe that there are some common denominators that exist among young male and female voters. And I don't want to sound redundant, but I do believe they are associated with the issues of the day. And I have found that my conversations with both have more or less been those universal issues that they both groups, both genders are concerned about. I will tell you that some of the conversation starters that I've had have been more of a listening session than me telling them why they need to vote. It's more or less, why haven't you voted? Are you registered? If you're not, why not? And as I heard Stephanie said, I believe you have to partner with that person, be willing to take that step with them in a very non-judgmental form. I know a young man who tells the story to date. He was a friend of my daughter's, and he came over to the house with her, just a casual friend. And the conversation, of course, I talk to everybody about voting. That's just a way of life in our household.
All right,
and
welcome to the house. Welcome to the house. Now on the couch. What do you think about voting?
Yeah. So the young man told me that he was not registered to vote. And I just really calmly talked to him, about the history of African Americans and what we went through to secure this, God-given right to us. And then he went and registered to vote. And now he tells that as his testimonial about how, Mayor Broom is the person who motivated me to go vote. So I just think we have to seize the moment, seize these opportunities in a very non-judgmental but caring and concerning way. As I said, I'm a baby boomer, and for me, there was no question of whether I was going to register to vote or vote, because I grew up in the 60s. And so when I first went to vote, I'm not going to tell you who the first president I voted for, but when I first went, to vote, I just like Leah and Stephanie, I believe, said, my parents even took me into the voting booth with them. We didn't have the kid ballot, but they would take me into the booth with them. And when it came time for me to register to vote, it was just part of what I understood was the right thing to do, what I needed to do, especially as an African American growing up in the 60s and seeing the struggle that took place.
That's important. I want to open that question up to the other two of you. Do you see any gender dynamics when you're talking to voters that, anything that or anything we could do that would better get more, particularly, let's be frank, like getting more young Black men to turn out and vote?
Yeah, I think it's messengers. Whenever we're working on any type of event, it's just harder to get Black men engaged, especially of a certain age group. So, tonight, Chris Paul's joining us, but Chris is like in the mix. His parents taught him very well. But, it's like pulling teeth to get others. I mean, there's some usual suspects. We also know through some research that if you're not a person that's talked about these issues, as young people are skeptical. They think that you might be getting paid. They don't think that it's genuine. So that's why it's so important to have Black men, public figures, consistently talking about voting, to build up that trust that voters will be attracted to. But then you have the distractions like Lil Wayne and others who say, they're voting for people because of taxes, or they're not voting at all. And so it's the voices. That's one. Another thing that was really funny with our research is that moms play a really big role, moms of boys. So we're talking college age or about 25. We asked them what one of the biggest motivating factors to vote, and they said their mother. Now I was like, seriously, aren't you kind of grown at that point? But your mommy has to tell you to vote. But if your mommy has to tell you to go vote, then the moms have to make sure their sons are voting. We know that works. So it really is a messenger. It also is the topic that you're bringing up. So from, economic issues are always at the forefront. These men are trying to take care of their families. And there's challenges there. We know that criminal justice reform issues sometimes work, right? But there's two sets of people here. They care about that or they care about this. So it's making sure that we're messaging and we're using people that they understand and like and respect, and there's the consistency. And then the women in their lives are also pushing them. Just like they push them to go to the doctor and do other things, they have to push them to go vote as well.
Right. Lee, did you want to get in on this or?
Yeah, no, I agree with everything that Stephanie said, but I just feel like there was so much investment in 2020 when it came to our elections. I just hope that this continues for municipal races and also in 2022, because we always see a drop off in midterm elections, and we just need to continue pushing, continue engaging those trusted messengers now. So people continue to be engaged next year, because I'm very concerned about the potential for drop off next year.
You're muted, Jamal. You're muted.
Thank you. Sorry. I got a 2-year-old who might be crying in the background. So if you hear that, that's what it is. If you, Lee, I'm wondering if you detected any of the voter suppression messaging working. Is that something that people are responding to in any of your work so far? Stephanie talked to it earlier, but what are you hearing?
Yeah, I think the misinformation is huge. I was looking at some of our stories from our canvassers in 2020, and some people received those robocalls and flyers in the mail saying, you can vote online, right? You can vote on Monday instead, or Wednesday instead of Tuesday. And when our canvassers called voters, some of them said, "Oh, I'm just going to do it online," right? Which we don't have that in our country right now. You can register to vote online, but you cannot vote online for various reasons. But it really impacts people. And when I worked at Leadership Conference, there's a whole effort to make sure that there's monitoring of misinformation and disinformation on social media platforms, so the correct information can go out to voters to try to get ahead of it. But it's a concern, and it's really important that we're having these conversations to combat the misinformation.
All right. Well, let us close this out. I want to give anybody a chance. Let's do a little last statement. Stephanie, I'll start with you. Anything you want to make sure people pay attention to and they know about what you've got going on and what's coming up?
Yeah, so I would ask everyone to follow us on all social platforms at When We All Vote, so you can keep up with what we're doing. We would love for mayors and their teams to post us. We have a lot of educational materials, but we also have opportunities for your community to do some direct engagement with us in your own city. And stay tuned for Civic Cities. We are relaunching very soon. We're going to have an advisory council of mayors that we will work with all across this country to make sure that we are making it easy for these offices to participate. We understand sometimes there's not budget for this work, so we want to make sure that we're making it as easy as possible, but we're also giving you as much as many resources as we can so that you can do this important work to not only institutionalize voter registration in a different way in your city, but also do some fun things with us from now until the end of time, because we'll be around for a while, and we have next year to really worry about, as Lee mentioned, and then we're on to 24. So we've got a lot of work to do. We definitely need mayors and their teams behind this important work. And if you'd like to get in touch with us, please, we'll make sure that we send an email out so that you have all of our contact information, and you can get in touch with our team fairly easy. Thank you.
Sounds good. Lee, turn it over to you.
Sure. Yes. So Deliver My Vote, we are working in 5 states over the next 4 years, year round. So we are working in Georgia, Florida, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. So we're really looking forward to partnering with mayors in those states so we can get accurate, reliable information to voters as soon as possible about how they can vote and register to vote and vote by mail. So we're very excited to partner with allied organizations and also mayors And you can go to delivermyvote.org for more information.
Awesome. Thank you. And Mayor Broom, we will let our elected leader take us home. What else should we be thinking about before we close up?
Well, I guess my message is that elected officials really have to be willing to expend as much political capital as possible to fight back against these policies. And we need to work hand in hand with our community to do this. I believe that we have to continue the good fight of working against policies that try to set us back on the local and state level. And that we have to be willing to step up and understand that much of the change, of course, that we want to see will be derived from the local level. And we are the front lines of this fight.
All right. Thank you very much. I want to thank this fantastic panel for being here. Mayor Davis, who's already taken off. Mayor Broom, thank you. This was very helpful and to listen to you talk about this. Inspirational leader here. And Stephanie and Lee, always happy to see you too. So I'm going to turn this back over to my folks at AAMA. I think Antonio may be getting in here to tell everybody what's next. There he is.
Well, good afternoon. This has been an amazing session. Thank you all so much for joining us. To Jamal, thank you for moderating our conversation today. Well, that's going to do it for us here today at the African American Mayors Association. Thank you for joining, using our voice, a conversation, a discussion on voting rights. Thank you so much. And be sure to follow us on social media at our mayors for any additional updates. Thank you so much. Have a great day, everyone.